Let's take a look here at the 2012 macro exam, FRQ question number 2. This is going to be a bank balance sheet problem. All right, there we are. Okay, so simplified balance sheet for Mi Tierra Bank in the United States. Okay, there you see it, the assets and liabilities T chart there. Okay, so part A, what is the reserve requirement? Okay, so a reserve requirement, again, is required reserves divided by your demand deposits. Okay, so let's calculate. Up here, we have sort of a split out required reserve section. So we have 10,000 over demand deposits are 100. So it's a nice sort of round number there of 10%. So that's our reserve requirement, 10% of demand deposits. All right, so let's go to part B now. We're going to do a transaction. So assume that Luis withdraws $5,000 in cash from his checking account at Mi Tierra Bank. And then they're going to ask us sort of about all these different effects of this withdrawal. So let's, what I like to do when there's a sort of a transaction on a balance sheet is sort of update the balance sheet to show what happened. Okay, so withdrawing $5,000 in cash from checking account. Okay, so this is the checking account, right? Demand deposits. So we need to reflect that $5,000 has been withdrawn there. So we subtract 5,000 there. So the new number here should be 95,000. Okay, so well, where does that 5,000 come from? We need to get rid of this, right? So they needed to pay that cash. So that balances out there. Okay. So there's another adjustment we need to make when we get to part 3 here, but I'm just going to, based on this transaction, so we balanced, so this is 0. So these balance out, right? So we subtracted assets and liabilities I'm talking about here. So we subtracted 5,000 from liabilities. So we also have to subtract 5,000 from assets so that they balance out. So in fact, we did that, right? We have 95,000 over here. We got 85 and 10, so 95,000 over here. So as long as these balance, you know you've done sort of the correct transaction here. Now, there's something, like I said, there's something else we'll have to do because the required reserves has changed, but we'll do that in a minute. So part 1, but how much will the bank's reserves change based on Luis's withdrawal? You have to be careful about how you word this. You could say total reserves, or you could say excess reserves decreased by 5,000. And that's what we did here, right? We reduced this 5,000 from excess reserves. So you could phrase this, as this total reserves, right? And for sure that decreased. So what you can't say is anything about required reserves, right? Required reserves did not go down by $5,000 here because we had to take it out of excess. So you have to be careful about saying either total reserves or excess reserves were reduced by 5,000. Okay, part 2, what is the initial effect of the withdrawal on the M1 measure of money supply, and then explain. Well, this is no effect. So this is one of those questions where they ask about M1. Both cash and demand deposits are considered part of M1. So really, you're just changing the composition of M1 from a demand deposit to cash, but the whole pile of M1 is not changing itself, right? You're just changing the composition of it. So, you know, no effect on M1, and some explanation there saying that, well, you know, cash and demand deposits are both part of M1. So when you move one to the other, you're not affecting the total. A little sentence or two explaining that. All right, so I mentioned part 3. As a result of the withdrawal, what is the new value of excess reserves on the balance sheet of the bank based on the reserve requirement from part A? All right, so I didn't do anything between the reserves earlier. I said I would come back to it. And this question is, you know, what is the new value of excess reserves? If you didn't realize that it changed before, that's kind of a clue saying, oh, wait, well, maybe something happened. Sure enough, right? So you need to figure out the new required reserves, right? So we said initially 10% is the reserve ratio, but our demand deposits change, right? So we have 95,000 over here. So instead of 100,000 times 10%, now you got to take 95,000 times 10%. So this amount is changing. 95,000 times 10% is 9,500. Now we still have to balance, right? So we reduce this factor. So somewhere over here, there should be $500, right? So if our balance required reserves is 9,500, but we still had 10,000 in there, then we're going to move 500 of that over here to excess reserves, right? So we subtracted 500 here from this category, but then we added 500 here. So this still balances. And then if you want to double check, okay, this side liabilities, I had 95,000. Do I have 85,000 here? And then another 9,500. Okay, so that's 10,000. So yes, I have 95,000 equals 95,000. So that's sort of a tricky one, but you got to realize, okay, wait, because my demand deposits changed, I need to recalculate what my required is. And then if we have more in there, right, that extra is going to go over to the excess reserves category. Okay. Part C, assume that the next day John withdraws from the bank an amount that exceeds the bank's excess reserves. Assuming that no loans are called in, how can the bank cover its required reserves? All right, so a bank finds that, oh, shoot, all of a sudden we don't have enough in required reserves. What are we going to do? Well, they can borrow money short term. And where they would do that, from either the Federal Reserve, if needed, or other banks. Some banks might have a surplus, right? They might be willing to loan money out. And then other banks, if they found, oh, shoot, we're short, we need a little bit extra to have more in required reserves, then they could go out in the market and borrow money from other banks. So just a sort of sentence there saying that, oh, well, the bank could borrow whatever they needed on a short-term basis from the Federal Reserve or other banks.